Hello and welcome to this video on brewing your own barley wine. A barley wine's a drink with a long history, and not just in its use, but often in the actual bottled drink since it ages very well. In fact, historically it was partly what inspired Indian pale ales. A barley wine is called a wine largely owing to how alcoholic it is. Anywhere between 6%, which is about a typical beer, a bit strong but still a beer, all the way up to 12%, which is more consistent with the definition of a wine as such. But since this is made from grain, obviously barley, it's, well, a beer, not a wine. Nonetheless, it's still produced fairly regularly and it's more likely to have an annual release rather than a consistent year-round production, which is another reason why it's also considered a wine. There are two styles of barley wine which are typically available. These are your American and your British. The Americans tend to have considerably more hops added and as a result are much more bitter. The coloration's also generally much lighter, somewhere between an amber-like colour to a light brown. The English style generally is a much less hopped variety, let's say. This means that they are much less bitter. Also, the coloration is notably different. They tend to be a reddish gold colour through to an almost black colour. With that in mind, let's look at what we're going to make. Now, for the majority of people, they'll want to start with an English-style barley wine. It is less aggressively hopped and arguably somewhat sweeter. This means you can appreciate the complexity of flavour, or at least not be choked by the drink the same way your girlfriend looks at you after you make a mistake. This will also taste much more of toffee, caramel and fruits, to a certain extent more akin to a burnt sugar or a molasses if you will. To make our barley wine we'll need the following. Rather obviously, a malt, unless you've never seen it before. A malt is properly called malted barley and is barley that has been, rather obviously, malted. We can use hops, but this will be a minority of inclusions and just as easily ignored for the most part. We'll also need yeast. In this case we're using a particular hopsAle yeast, but anything suitable for you could be used. If you're going traditional, then this is just about everything you'll need. You'll obviously require some equipment such as fermenters, kettles and so on, but overall, nothing special if you do it particular ways. For example, with modern technology ingredients in pellets, you might want to use a lot of sugar rather than as much barley. Now, this will have a secondary effect of increasing the alcohol by volume, something that can make storage, especially in the long term, a little easier. You can also consider using malt extract instead of malt itself. And then you may also want to consider the addition of other grains, small amounts of these, more as an adjunct for flavour, so wheat and rye are good examples. In this particular example, we've used a pale malt to start with, and we started with a malt extract, just to give us a nice simple base that we can build on, without having to worry about that flavour as much. We've then proceeded to use a whole grain malt on top of this, and we've ground and then extracted it. On top of that, we were considering adding hops, but in the end decided not to. After this, we've used the hopsAle yeast, which has been cultured and grown up to a reasonably large amount, and you could just use a straight packet of yeast suitable to your purposes. We then added water to this to make it up to a volume somewhere around 10 litres. We've had to adjust slightly, allowing for the fact that we've added the extracted malt and the wort from the kettle, but overall it came out at a batch about 10 litres. To get that 10 litres, we've both gone through the mashing and boiling process. The mashing is arguably the easiest of these. It involves heating your grain, in this case anyway, and we bring it up to a temperature around 70 to 75 degrees, or thereabouts, and we hold it at that temperature for about an hour. We keep stirring and mixing it for that entire time. The idea at this stage is just to extract as much of the sugar out of the grain as we can. Now that we've begun the boiling process, which is the next, we let it cool down. And we let it cool down to somewhere around 60 degrees. And we keep it here for somewhere between an hour and 2 hours. Now, the more you're doing, the longer it will take to heat up. But once it gets to the right temperature, you want to keep it at there for about the same time frame. If you're going to add hops, add them at this stage now. Now, as noted, we won't be doing so, but if you are, just be aware of it. If you add hops, you add them and keep them in there, ideally in something like a muslin bag, for about 60 minutes. If you're then going to add more hops again, for example if you're double hopping or similar, or if you want to add more flavour rather than just bitterness, you add them again for another 15 to 20 and even 30 minutes in some cases. Typically, it's worth noting that you won't add aroma hops, mostly because the time frame in which you store this, a lot of those aromatics don't really survive very well. Basically, you waste your time, effort, and hops if you do it. You then bring the contents down to temperature. This should be done as quickly as possible, but, well, practicalities of life, it may not always be so easy to do. After you've added your cooled wort to your fermenting vessel, you add your yeast, and you want to try and keep the temperature somewhere around 20 degrees Celsius, or somewhere in the ballpark of 65 freedom units. Once you've cooled it down and you've added your yeast, you can fundamentally leave it and wait for the fermentation to finish. Now, the fermentation itself will take somewhere around 2 to 3 weeks. The more active yeast strains may be done sooner, but you'll notice that they're most active at the start of the fermentation, and the bubbling will taper off further towards the end. In terms of this initial fermentation, what you would be expecting to see, at least in your initial gravity, your OG reading, is 1.1, and your final gravity will be just over 1.02, if not just below 1.02. It'll be somewhere in that range. Admittedly, it's going to be a little bit vague, as it will depend considerably on your local conditions, yeast, the malt extracts you've used, how active the yeast is. There's a range of factors, but the goalpost is to drop it that far. Your secondary fermentation will take another 2 to 3 weeks if you're lucky, let's say, in that that's the time frame it should take. Now, this doesn't always work out that way, unfortunately, but nonetheless, that's the rough time frame, and the advantages of doing this is that it should help to remove a lot of the unwanted flavours, one advantage to, well, brewing barley wine. The next advantage is going to be the aging, and aging is one of the distinguishing features of a barley wine. In fact, they do so for a very long time, another contributing factor to why they're called a kind of wine, a misnomer of sorts, kind of like how pear-based cider is a misnomer, along with sake for that matter. The flavours and aromas, mostly flavours since most aromas won't last, tend to have an opportunity to become more relaxed and mellow, and in the case of harsher flavours, react and ideally break down and dissipate. This tends to happen, at least in part, during your secondary fermentation. If you're looking to try and carbonate this, you should either add carbonating drops or priming sugar into individual bottles, rather than during the secondary fermentation, with the slight caveat that it can be useful to add the bulk quantity, let's say, the total amount of carbonated sugars you need to your secondary fermenter, ensure they're at least somewhat stirred in, and not enough to disrupt any residues or sediment at the bottom, but enough to mix it consistently throughout the fermentation vessel, and then put it into individual bottles. But you only do that right before bottling. That's because the secondary fermentation can take up to a month, in extreme cases, typically somewhere around 3 weeks, and if you're able to get a very fast fermenting yeast, 2 weeks. From here, however, the time in the bottle is the, let's say, caveat that you need to be aware of. The bottles generally sit in storage and age or bottle condition for anywhere between 8 and 16 months. The sweet spot is about a year, and that's where you're likely to find the majority of them begin to reach their peak. They won't get any worse if you leave them for a bit longer, but any earlier and they tend to be not as good. So a rough idea is a year after you've done this, you can probably start drinking it with reliable comfort. A little bit earlier and you might have a few bottles that aren't quite as good. You will, however, have to have a taste, let's say, between when you start aging and when the final time frame is done and the last bottle is consumed to know just which of them is right. So, unfortunately, at least as far as this video goes, there won't be much of an update on this between now and the time we crack open the first bottle of barley wine. But if commercial products are anything to go by, then we should be looking forward to a very nice bottle in a year or more. This is how you make barley wine. It's a long-running and historically accurate ale that is just something unique and rarely sourced from commercial breweries. In the case of commercial products, it just takes too long, it has too much demand for storage, and there's too little profit margin for many breweries to be willing to produce and sell it. That means if you want to try and enjoy barley wine reliably and without having to sell a kidney, your only option is to make it yourself. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.